Chapter 1. The river smelled like wet iron and old paint, a quiet graveyard of ships that hadn't moved since doughboys came home from France. Locals called it the Ghost Fleet, long rows of World War I hulls sleeping on the James River, their plates scabbed with rust, seams bleeding orange down black sides, names scoured off by time and tide. They were not supposed to matter. They were supposed to be the end of a story. And then the morning of December 7th, 1941, made them a beginning. Pearl Harbor didn't just puncture battleships in Hawaii. It punctured any illusion that America could wait, rebuild slowly, or choose a polite, deliberate war. In the weeks that followed, survey launches began to nose along these forgotten hulls in the gray light, naval inspectors stepping across frost-slick gangways with clipboards and lanterns. Rivets were tapped, plates were measured, prop shafts were spun by hand. The question was no longer, what does it cost to fix? The question was, what would it cost to leave this idle? On paper, the James River hulks were liabilities, aging steam plants, obsolete wiring, brittle steel. In a mobilization, they became a catalog, patterns for plate sizes, models for frame spacing, and, most importantly, ready-made tonnage you could nurse back to life while the factories spun up. America didn't just need glamorous carriers and fast battleships. It needed everything: tankers, oilers, colliers, ammunition ships, reefers, repair ships, floating dry docks, tugs, barges, net tenders, and humble merchantmen that could carry the bullets, beans, and black oil, without which fleet actions were just theater. "Get me hulls," one Navy Yard chief told his foreman. "We can teach them anything once they float." The Ghost Fleet gave the nation a head start in an industrial war that would be timed in weeks and measured in miles of weld. Old triple expansion engines were overhauled. Pitted plates were cropped and inserted. Some hulls were cannibalized to feed others, a boneyard sacrifice that turned steel skeletons into a living logistics chain. And as these relics creaked awake, engineers were already drawing something faster: welded ships in standard sections, mass-produced like farm tools. The Ghosts had a purpose now, not just as reactivations, but as teachers. Their frames taught the new welders how steel behaved. Their hatches taught the planners where cargo flowed. Their forgotten problems taught the designers what to avoid. Even their mooring lines taught urgency when a winter squall snapped two of them like twine and sent a hull thudding into a neighbor with a sound like a church bell. From the bridge wings of a moving tug, the river looked like a production line waiting for a foreman. Boilers lit reluctantly and then steadied. Condensers hissed awake. Steam warmed the joints of steel that had frozen into silence for 2 decades. Night crews worked by strings of bulbs that gave the whole anchorage an eerie carnival glow. Men and women, new hires who'd never seen a ship up close, learned to read chalk marks on plates and the shivering language of oxyacetylene flame. And in the war rooms far from the riverbank, planners stared at maps of the Pacific and realized a harsh arithmetic. Japan's navy was a blade so sharp that any single battle could cut deep. But the handle of that blade, the factory floors, oil tanks, steel mills, and trained crews, was short. America's handle, if built long enough, would turn the war from fencing into grappling. The Ghost Fleet was proof of concept. A nation could reach back into a forgotten past, grab hold of steel, and drag the future forward. Chapter 2. Before the new ships, there would be simpler miracles. Finding work where there had been none, and discovering that unskilled was just a word people used when they hadn't yet been taught. Shipyards from Newport News to the Columbia River boomed into 24-hour organisms. 3 shifts meant 3 Americas meeting under arc light. Old riveters teaching teenagers how to swing a sledge without smashing their thumbs. Farmhands learning to run cranes with hands that remembered plows. Women stepping into coveralls, gloves, headscarves, and the good shoes they didn't mind ruining. The word Rosie started as a poster. It became a real person whose welds would pass X-ray inspection at 2 a.m. after a 12-hour shift and a bus ride home to make breakfast for kids. Henry Kaiser's West Coast yards made the change visible. The man had not built ships before. He built ways to build ships. A Liberty ship started as parts on paper. Standardized plates, frames, bulkheads, deckhouses, all cut and assembled in subsections that moved through the yard as if they were cattle at a stockyard or Fords on a line. Welders stitched where riveters would have hammered. New sectional jigs turned guesswork into geometry. "Break the work into what can be learned in a week," Kaiser said, and he meant it. Crews specialized until speed itself became a craft. You didn't just lay a bead. You laid the same bead, in the same place, the same way, thousands of times. And the act became music. By 1943, America was launching over 100 ships a month. In some yards, a Liberty ship slid down the ways every few days. In some famous trials, one went from keel laying to launching in under a week. Stunts, yes, but also proofs. None of it would matter if the ships were empty or the crews green. The Navy solved both problems with a pipeline mentality. As hulls advanced from plate shop to outfitting pier, schools advanced humans from "who me" to "I, sir." Armed guard gunners learned to track incoming at night from the stern of a freighter. Radio operators learned to hear Morse through static and fear. Merchant marine officers learned convoy discipline and zigzag patterns, and they learned the hard truth that on the long ocean, courage is mostly patience. The Pacific ate patience by the day and the gallon. To carry war across that map, you didn't just need ships. You needed oilers in the right place at the right time and tank farms that moved. The Ghost Fleet had taught a humbling lesson. Tonnage sitting at anchor is neither ghost nor fleet. It's a promise, and promises go bad quickly. The reactivations created a first wave of useful hulls, but the strategy took shape in a different word: throughput. You measured success not by flags flown or silhouettes counted, but by the flow. Cargo tons per month, barrels delivered per day, sorties turned per week. The new ships would not be elegant. Some would be ugly enough to be lovable. But they would carry the war like arteries carry blood, and the ocean that had shielded America would become a highway America paved with steel. Somewhere in the Pacific, a Japanese staff officer sharpened a pencil and wrote, "Enemy logistical capacity unknown," and then circled the word that mattered most: unknown. Chapter 3. The Liberty ship looked like a rectangle that had a dream about being a ship and barely made it. Blunt bow, boxy house, a single stack, 3 masts, 5 hatches, and a profile that made poets shrug. But the numbers sang. At roughly 10,000 deadweight tons and a cruising speed around 11 knots, a Liberty could carry future history. Tanks that would grind on coral, radios that would out-talk storms, flour that would become bread on a destroyer's mess line, and bullets that would change futures one squeeze at a time. Uglier than a bucket of bolts, sailors joked. And then they watched German U-boats burn when armed guards manned 3-inch and 20mm guns, and convoy escorts threw hedgehogs like fistfuls of nails in the dark. The Liberty's real beauty was that you could make another one tomorrow. Standards were the secret weapon. With standardization, you could teach anyone anywhere to cut the same plate, drill the same hole, weld the same joint. You could move a foreman from Oregon to Louisiana, and he would recognize the skeleton of the ship the way a farmer recognizes a plow he's never seen before. You could mass-produce spare parts and know they'd fit. You could lay out a pipe run once and write it down so it wouldn't have to be invented every morning. Victory ships refined the idea. Faster, stronger, with a different hull form and more power, better suited to outrun danger and keep up with new convoy speeds. Between them, Liberty and Victory turned the ocean into lanes of cargo that thickened like arteries in a growing body. Escorts wrapped that body in armor the enemy couldn't ignore. Destroyer escorts sprouted like young trees, smaller than destroyers, cheaper to build, armed heavily enough to frighten submarines and sometimes kill them. And then came the little flat tops, escort carriers built on converted merchant hulls, or built that way from scratch, flinging wildcats and Avengers into the air to find submarines by day, to put bombs and depth charges where sonar said steel was lurking. Park a handful of them around a convoy, and you changed the ocean from a wolf's hunting ground into a minefield for the wolves. It wasn't romantic like a fleet carrier trading blows with big-deck enemies. It was patient, cumulative, and devastating. The arithmetic favored the side that could restart the count every sunrise. If Liberty and Victory ships were the arteries, oilers were the beating heart. Fleet oilers like the Cimarron class took what had once been a harbor job, refueling, and turned it into a ballet at sea. Lines shot across, fuel hissed. Ships kept station in swells that made deck planks flex, and the work went on because timer and tide didn't ask politely. Underway replenishment, once an oddity, became routine. And routine is the kind of miracle that wins wars. A carrier that doesn't have to steam back to Pearl or San Diego to tank up is a carrier that can strike today, rearm tonight, and hit somewhere else tomorrow. What had begun on a quiet river, those old hulls blinking awake, had become a mobile base as large as a nation and as nimble as a task force. Japan had built a navy to fight battles. America was building a system to fight a war. Chapter 4. Japanese planners had bet the empire on decisive engagements, cut the enemy's head, and the body dies. At Pearl Harbor, they had tried to cut the head. In the Indian Ocean, in the early months, they slashed at British strength. In the Solomons, they hacked at the American throat every night with the Tokyo Express, destroyers streaking down the slot to deliver troops and shells. But a war of decapitation struggled against an enemy that kept growing new heads. Every time American carriers took losses, yards stitched together replacements and training squadrons pushed new pilots into cockpits. Every time submarines found prey, new tonnage replaced what sank. Every time a convoy was mauled, the next convoy was larger and better escorted. American shipbuilding didn't just erase losses. It erased the meaning of losses. At staff tables in Tokyo, intelligence summaries began to sound like weather reports with no sky, estimates of American industrial potential, guesses about launch rates, speculation about training throughput. It all converged on a truth the Imperial Navy didn't want to print. The enemy could grow combat power faster than the Empire could destroy it. This was not a failure of bravery or seamanship. It was a failure of arithmetic. A single submarine could send a Maru to the bottom with 2 torpedoes. 10 submarines could make an island garrison hungry. 100 submarines could starve a campaign. But on the other end of those torpedoes, America built 100 merchantmen in the time it took Japan to lay down a dozen. You can't sink a river with torpedoes. On the water, this reality announced itself in strange ways. An escort carrier with a deck crew half made up of people who'd never seen the sea before. The war would trap a zero in a web of fire over a convoy, while below decks, someone from Kansas learned to change a high-pressure fuel filter by smell because the light always seemed to go out at the worst moment. A CB battalion would carve a ramp out of coral in less time than it took a Japanese staff memo to arrive at a consensus. A floating dry dock would rise like a steel cathedral in a lagoon at Ulithi, swallow a cruiser damaged by a kamikaze, and spit it back out in fighting trim 6 days later. The Japanese Navy had planned for battles. The Americans built a factory that floated. None of this reduced the ferocity of the fighting. In the Solomons, iron laws were written in the iron-bottom sound. Off Samar, tiny escort carriers and destroyers would throw themselves into a storm of shellfire and come out legends. At Okinawa, suicide planes turned the sky into a graveyard of aluminum. But even there, behind the smoke, the machine kept moving. Tankers fueled picket destroyers. Ammunition ships replaced what had been hurled into the air. Hospital ships filled and sailed and returned. The Ghost Fleet's lesson, the idea that dormant steel could be a seed, had germinated into an archipelago of capability. Japan could see the leaves. It struggled to understand the roots. Chapter 5. A mobile base is a simple idea that took a world war to perfect. Instead of waiting for the war to come to your ports, you bring your ports to the war. The Pacific is cruel to planners whose arrows are longer than their supply lines. America's answer was to uplift the shoreline and set it floating. Oilers for fuel, ammunition ships for bang, provision ships for stomachs, repair ships for scars, and floating dry docks for wounds that would have been mortal in any earlier conflict. The names sounded like paperwork. AO for oiler, AE for ammunition ship, AF for stores ship, AR for repair, ABSD for a big sectional dry dock. But together they were a city that could sail. Ulithi Atoll became the symbol and the proof. Sail in, and you saw a lagoon turned into a movable Pearl Harbor without the marble and the complacency. Tenders rearming destroyers, carriers trading pilots with training flights that had arrived over the horizon, tugboats that never slept, pushing barges stacked with crates that had never touched soil. A destroyer could pull alongside an AR and watch machinists who had never met her fix parts they had never seen before, with tools they had brought from factories a world away. And if the damage was too deep for topside tinkering, the big dry dock yawned open and swallowed the ship as gently as a grandmother. The ocean no longer sent Americans home to heal. It sent them to the next staging lagoon. The speed of this mobile base killed plans that had been drafted in another century. Japan had framed campaigns around seasonal weather, shipping cycles, and the apparent limits of an enemy that had to cross half an Earth to fight. The mobile base bent those cycles. When a task force finished striking in the Marshalls, it could replenish at sea, dart to the Carolines, and appear where the enemy expected a pause. When a destroyer squadron emptied its magazines at night, it could rearm at dawn and go hunting at dusk again. Suddenly, operational tempo wasn't a nice phrase. It was a weapon. Attack today, refill tonight, hit somewhere else tomorrow. Never give your opponent a blank page to plan on. The machine only worked because people did. Oilers rendezvoused on time in seas that like to break clocks. Boatswains backed down exactly enough to hold lines tight between ships whose wakes were trying to rip them apart. Ammunition handlers learned to move death safely faster than anyone had believed possible. Quartermasters plotted alongside cargo officers, navigating not just a course through waves, but a schedule through chaos. In the bowels of repair ships, a welder from New Orleans might stop to shake a hand before striking an arc, and then the arc's light would carve a crescent smile in a darkness that smelled like oil and victory. Every task was a piece of a giant that no one person could see, and that was the genius of it. You didn't need to see the whole machine to make the next bead straight. Chapter 6. Back on the home front, the war was a river of work. The Ghost Fleet had taught the first crews what steel forgot. The new yards taught the nation what it could remember. In cities where ship whistles had been silent since the Depression, horns began to blow for shift changes, and cafeterias ran out of coffee by 10 in the morning because nobody wanted to be the one who took a break while a hull section waited. There were new faces and new rules to honor them. Women who had been told they lacked the hands for heavy work found themselves teaching men 10 years younger how to make a route pass that would hold a ship together when the sea wanted to tear it apart. Black workers and union leaders forced doors that had been closed. A war for democracy has a way of reminding the hypocrite that his workforce is part of his army. There were strikes because grown-ups argue before they get great things done. And then there were agreements, because the war would not wait for anyone's pride to ripen. Training solved what prejudice invented. If you can learn to milk a tough cow without losing your temper, you can learn to handle a torch. If you can run a press that stamps truck fenders, you can learn to cut frames. If you can braid hair, you can lay cable. If you can file a perfect tax return, you can read a blueprint. The yards built schools not out of charity, but out of need. The result was competence at scale. Inspections that got faster without getting sloppy. Material handling that got safer while moving more. Safety records that improved even as lines sped up. "We're not dumbing the work down," a foreman said. "We're smartening the tools up." Every launch became a holiday. People dressed their kids in Sunday clothes to watch a gray giant slide into water and become a ship with a name. Bottles broke, flags flew. Brass bands did what brass bands do to ordinary hearts. What people didn't see was the finer music that played long after the speeches. The whine of capstans, the clack of shackles, the measured shout of line handlers as tugs took strain and eased a new hull to a berth where outfitting would finish the job. In that quiet choreography was the secret the enemy would never quite pin down. America had learned to turn pride into process. As the first runs turned into a flood, the narrative shifted. The Ghost Fleet had been our proof that somnolent tonnage can be roused. Now the nation proved that the sleep would never return. By 1943, the phrase "over 100 ships a month" stopped sounding like a mistake. In 1944, it became background noise. Meanwhile, in Japanese shipyards, Apprenticeship still ruled, sections weren't standardized, and welding was less a plan than an afterthought. Where America taught 100,000 people to do 10 things well, Japan trained 10,000 to do 100 things the old way. In peacetime, that can build beautiful ships. In a war of attrition, it can build defeat. Chapter 7. On charts, the Pacific looks like blank space. In war, it fills with little annotated truths, a convoy route here, a submarine patrol box there, an island garrison's daily ration in scribbles and frowns. By 1943, those scribbles showed a new reality. American logistics could bend space. Task forces could leap from one anchorage to the next, because the ocean between them had been seeded with fuel and ammunition, and because new hulls were arriving faster than anyone could invent reasons to delay them. Japanese planners, brilliant at night fighting and long lance torpedoes, could not find an answer to cargo tonnage. You can't outrange a ship that appears at your flank tomorrow, because somewhere tonight, 30,000 barrels of fuel crossed paths with a carrier group in the dark. The convoy lifeline across the Central Pacific took on a rhythm. Liberty after liberty slid by in gray columns, each one a floating catalog of needs. Bulldozers to build a runway before the next rain. Radio spare parts because static is an enemy. Drums of aviation gasoline that stank of speed. Crates of canned fruit that would taste like home at Euro 200 after a long watch. It seemed mundane. It was sublime. The most decisive naval action of the war might have been a calm day when a tanker topped off a carrier while the crew in the scullery argued over coffee strength. From that refueling came the next strike, and from that strike came ground the Japanese would not get back. Submarines turned the other side of the ledger into a cliff. American skippers learned patience the hard way in 1942, ate heartbreak from dud torpedoes, fixed the problem with anger and engineering, and then rewrote the margins of empire with detonations under hulls. Japan had built a navy to defend sea lanes it had not resourced. Oil had to come from the south. Steel had to move. Troops needed rice. When Maris began to vanish, sucked under by tungsten and timing, garrisons learned a different vocabulary for hunger. You could dismiss one convoy as bad luck. You could explain away a month as enemy effort. You could not explain a trend when whole regions started living on memories of full warehouses. Logistics is not a headline until it ends. And then it writes the headline for everything that follows. At forward anchors like Manus and Majuro, the mobile base made courage renewable. A destroyer that had sprinted into gunfire could back down to a tender and receive a new gun barrel like a knight receiving a new lance in the middle of a battle. A carrier could swap a squadron and a doctrine in the same week. The enemy's pattern has changed, so will ours. That sort of adaptive violence is only possible when the skeleton is sound and the blood plentiful. America's shipyards and training cadres had become bones and marrow. The Ghost Fleet, those old ghosts still plying coastal routes after conversion or cannibalization, had become the elders in a family that was now too big to count. Chapter 8. Japan's worst day did not necessarily involve the largest explosions. It might have been an evening in 1944 when an intelligence officer leaned back from a table littered with reports and wrote, as neutrally as he could, "Enemy industrial mobilization exceeds prior estimates by factor uncertain, likely 2 or greater." Reports had been coming in for months. Photographs of West Coast yards stacked with sections, radio intercepts hinting at convoy sizes that felt like counting stars, POW statements from merchant sailors who described training schools and repair cycles that never seemed to stutter. When the enemy's machines can remake themselves faster than you can break them, tactics become prayers. In sea fights, Japan still drew blood that stunned. At Leyte Gulf, battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor hurled shells across distances that made admirals into mathematicians. Off Samar on October 25, 1944, tiny escort carriers and their tin can guardians wrote a chapter nobody could have plotted in peacetime. Taffy 3 ran into a storm of steel, and then those little ships turned in and charged. Destroyers threw torpedoes like accusations, and then hid in their own smoke. Pilots launched with what they had, some with machine guns and a prayer, and dived again and again until the enemy believed something larger must be hiding behind that kind of audacity. It was one of the war's purest distillations of courage. But even there, the system was present as a ghost hand on the shoulder. Those escort carriers existed because yards could build them at scale. Their planes could fly again tomorrow because oilers and ammunition ships were schedules, not hopes. Back in the Empire, the curves went the wrong way. Japanese ship production never reached a flood. Bombing worsened it. Resources could not find the rails, and rails could not find the factories that had not yet been bombed. Skilled workers were scarce and growing scarcer. Welding, which could have sped things, remained an art the system did not systematize. The Imperial Navy's carriers died faster than they could be born. And behind it all, deeper than mere tonnage, lay the missing insight. Modern sea power is a system. It is not a single ship or a single yard or a single pilot. It is welders and cranes, training pipelines and dry docks, oilers and ammo ships, merchant hulls and escort screens, schedules kept by people who take their lunch standing up because the crane is already swinging. When Japan looked across the Pacific in 1945, it did not see a fleet in the old sense. It saw a weather pattern. You do not defeat weather. You endure it, or you get out of its way. The Ghost Fleet had become a front marching east, and every cold front carried rain. Chapter 9. Even Ghosts Retire. On the James River, some of the old hulls that had trained new hands and donated their organs to the young found their way back to quiet waters. Their work was done, not because it was small, but because it had become invisible. That is the strangest victory. To build a thing so large that no one can see it. The reserve fleet would never wear medals. It had taught a nation to learn fast. It had suggested that speed lay not in motion, but in design, that if you weld in sections and break jobs into repeatable tasks, you can build a ship faster than an enemy can sink one. The Ghost Fleet did not haunt the war. It seeded the Navy that won it. In 1945, harbors filled with ships that bore scars like family stories. A Liberty ship with a patch the size of a truck. A destroyer that had taken a bomb and been back at sea before the rumor of her death reached home. An oiler whose crew could run a fuel line blindfolded and had sometimes done so in weather that would have made anyone else swallow hard. Beyond the ships lay numbers that felt like folklore. 5,000+ vessels built. 50 million+ tons of hull and hope slid into water. Launch days that set records because the real record was how normal it all felt by then. America had turned overkill into a production science not out of cruelty, but clarity. When a continent-sized war asks how much you have, the only honest answer is more than you can count. peace cracked the machine, and that was healthy. Shifts ended, and foremen who had lived by whistles learned to live by clocks again. People who had married the yard married their homes back. The nation demobilized, but it kept a lesson close. The ocean will be a highway again someday, and the only way to prepare is to remember the maps you drew under fire. The reserve fleet became a memory layered in the mist over the James, barges swinging at anchor, gulls scolding, the patient slap of wind-driven chop against plates too tired to care. The ghosts were quiet because they had earned it. Japan's worst nightmare had never been a single American ship. It had been a culture of problem-solving turned into policy, and then into practice. It had been a democratic mobilization that turned cynics into believers and outsiders into craftsmen, and that assumed any person, given a plan and a chance, could become part of something too big to name. Admirals fight battles, nations fight wars. The Ghost Fleet's final gift was to remind America that its greatest weapon is not a ship, but citizens who choose to build them together. Chapter 10. Years later, a boy walked the James River shore with his grandfather and asked why so many ships sat so still. The old man squinted into a wind that tasted of tide and memory. "They're sleeping," he said. "They wake when we need them." The boy tried to imagine that awakening. Lights snapping on, whistles shrilling, chains clattering through hawsers, engines breathing deep for the first time in years. He tried to imagine the war stories inside each hull, and he could not. That was all right. Some stories are too large to carry whole. You carry the lesson instead. The lesson was not about steel alone. It was about systems, about a nation that could look at a tangle of problems and decide to untangle them with schedules, wrenches, and will. It was about building a school for welders faster than you can build a ship, and knowing that the school is the ship. It was about writing a standard so well that a stranger in a new town can pick it up and do the job tomorrow. It was about measuring success by flow, by how many tons cross a horizon line each day, by how many barrels meet how many thirsty engines when the clock says now. The Ghost Fleet taught humility, the kind that understands even a battleship needs a tug when the tide is wrong. And it taught ambition, the kind that believes you can make a harbor out of a lagoon if you bring enough cranes and courage. Why did America's Ghost Fleet become Japan's worst nightmare in World War II? Because it was never just a fleet. It was a signal. It signaled that America would not fight on anyone else's timetable. It signaled that a democracy could out-organize an empire. It signaled that the decisive battle would be fought daily, not on a map in one place, but on 1,000 docks, in 1,000 shops, in lines thrown between ships at sea where hands learned to trust rope more than fear. It signaled that while the enemy perfected a sword, America was building a forge that would outlast the war. In that forge, the ghosts found their second life. If you listen carefully on a winter morning, you can still hear the old sounds ride the wind up the river. A grinder's whine, a rivet's ping, a hoist's patient clatter as it sets a section down exactly where chalk says it belongs. They are not haunting sounds. They are instructions. Build the school. Standardize the part. Break the job into steps and teach each step well. Trust that ordinary people will do extraordinary things when the work has meaning and the plan respects their time. And remember that the sea, like history, forgives nothing but rewards preparation with something that looks a lot like luck. In the end, the war's outcome had been decided long before the last battleship fired its last broadside. It had been decided the day inspectors stepped across a frosty gangway on the James River and tapped a rivet on a forgotten hull. Not to judge the past, but to build a future. They were not resurrecting ghosts. They were planting seeds in steel. The harvest would come in convoys and task forces, in fuel lines stretched between ships that never should have met in seas that never favored charity, in carriers refueled under gray skies after long sorties, in repair crews who slept when the arc light buzz went quiet and woke when a siren insisted. The harvest would be a war shortened not by kindness but by competence. That is a hard mercy, and it belongs to the people who built it. So when the boy asked again why the ships were still, the old man took his time. "They're resting," he said, "but they remember." He did not say what the ships remembered, because the river already had. It remembered clipboards in cold hands, welds laid true by people who had learned yesterday and mastered today, oilers meeting carriers on schedules that cheated geography, yards that taught the country to keep promises at scale. The river remembered, and the world, for a while, learned to speak its language. If you can turn ghosts into a fleet, you can turn fear into a plan. If you can do that, nightmares don't stand a chance. Chapter 11. Epilogue is the wrong word for a system that never really ends. Call it aftermath, the quiet discipline that follows a thunderclap. When victory papers were signed and ships steamed home with decks crowded by men who tried to laugh louder than the ghosts, the problem changed, but did not disappear. The United States faced warehouses of spare parts, rosters of trained workers who had learned how to think with their hands, and fleets that could not all be kept warm without bankrupting the peace. What to store, what to scrap, what to seal in Greece and lay up in Anchorage. The answers wrote his operating manual for a century. If war is a test, peace is a grade. America tried to keep the right notes. The same logic that had awakened the Ghost Fleet now guided Mothball Rose from the James to Suisun Bay and beyond. Preserve the patterns, not just the parts. You can't hold on to every hull, but you can hold on to the knowledge of how to cut and fit and teach. Manuals, jigs, and training curricula were filed in cabinets as carefully as medals were placed in drawers. A system that had learned to measure success in throughput redefined throughput for a quieter age. Ships reactivated for Korea in weeks, not years. Yards that could remember how to speed up without repeating the mistakes of panic. The pipeline became an accordion. The music slower. The bellows still ready. For Japan, the nightmare had a different ending. Industry rebuilt in a peace that taught new lessons about standardization, quality, and flow, the very pillars that America had proved under fire. The post-war decades would see Japanese factories teach the world Toyota's just-in-time rhythms and lean systems that extracted waste the way wartime America had extracted speed. In that irony lay the war's cleanest legacy, competitors choosing to learn from each other's best truths rather than dying for their worst illusions. The ocean made neighbors of old enemies. Shipping lanes became veins of prosperity rather than targets, and the same Liberty hulls, rebadged, refitted, or reincarnated in their descendants, carried refrigerators and grain where they once carried howitzers and hope. But let's not forget the human math that powered the steel. A woman who had welded 20 feet above the ground with sparks in her scarf did not forget confidence because a siren went quiet. A black machinist who had fought for the right to run a lathe did not return willingly to a broom. Children who had watched a ship slide into the river did not walk away from engineering school when counselors doubted them. The war had rewired expectations. In thousands of small, stubborn ways, the workforce decided that the word unskilled would remain retired. That decision, more than any treaty, ensured that when the country needed to spin the wheels faster again, there were hands ready to grip them and eyes that had already learned to read the gauges. The lesson reaches further than shipbuilding. Modern power, sea, air, or silicon, is a choreography of systems that must be taught, not merely commanded. It is schedules that respect physics, inventories that respect uncertainty, and cultures that respect the dignity of the worker standing at the pinch point where plan meets reality. The Ghost Fleet story is not nostalgia for a rusted anchorage. It is a reminder of how quickly a democracy can move when it trusts its citizens to become specialists and then trusts those specialists enough to write the next manual. That trust turns politics into policy, policy into process, and process into ships that arrive where they are needed when they are needed. When the timing is right, the enemy's plan collapses into an empty stage. If you want a single image to hold, don't choose a carrier lit by sunrise or a battleship rolling a broadside across a blue horizon, though both are beautiful in ways that trouble poets. Choose two gray silhouettes at sea, close enough to pass a line, decks wet, cruise quiet in that focused way people get when the margin for error is small. A line snakes across. It bites the chalk. Tension rises. Fuel begins to move, invisible, life turning into motion. On one deck, a sailor checks a gauge. On the other, another sailor checks the same gauge. They do not know each other's names. They do not need to. Trust lives in the hose between them. That is modern sea power. That is what the Ghost Fleet woke up to become. When the boy by the river grew up, he took a job far from ships, writing software that had more in common with schedules than with sails. On a visit home, he asked his now older grandfather whether the ships still remembered. The old man smiled. They do when we do. In a world rushing toward new kinds of distance, digital oceans, supply chains that span hemispheres, his advice had the bite of old tools. Keep your standards close. Keep your training honest. Keep your capacity a little bigger than your need, because surprises don't RSVP. And if you have a choice between a gorgeous plan and a good pipeline, choose the pipeline. You can make a plan gorgeous later. A pipeline must be gorgeous now. So yes, America's Ghost Fleet became Japan's worst nightmare in a war decided by courage and numbers, by skies full of contrails and docks full of crates. But the nightmare was not the ships at anchor. It was the realization, arriving late, then arriving daily, that a free people can become a factory whose product is readiness. The hulls on the James were only the first whisper of that truth. The roar came later, from ways that never cooled, from cranes that moved like metronomes, from hands steady enough to weld while the world shook. The war ended, the river quieted, and the ghosts rested. The lesson did not sleep. It stands watch still, wrapped in the kind of silence you hear in a well-run plant at 3 a.m., when everything is moving, nobody is shouting, and the night understands that tomorrow has already begun.